Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. According to the 2022 Canadian Survey on Disability, the employment rate for persons with disabilities currently sits at 62%. While this figure has risen in recent years from 59% in 2017, it's clear that a lot more progress should be made in creating more inclusive and accessible workplaces for Canadians with disabilities. We're talking to accessibility experts from across the sector to find out about the challenges and barriers that contribute to this employment gap, along with what nonprofit organizations can do to address these barriers within workplaces, programming, and communities. Joining me to discuss these important issues is Anthony Frisina. Born with spina bifida and navigating the world in a wheelchair, Anthony works at Mohawk College and McMaster University. He's a sought-after public speaker, author, and consultant under his brand Above and Beyond, bridging the gap to accessibility and inclusion. Anthony serves on a number of boards and committees, including the City of Hamilton's Advisory Committee for Persons with Disabilities. He's been producing and hosting Above and Beyond TV on Cable 14, entering into the 5th season in the fall of 2023. In 2013, he was honored with a Mohawk College Alumni of Distinction Award and was named the Order of Hamilton in 2020. He's also an ambassador for the Forward Movement, which reframes the conversation around ability and promoting access and inclusion for people of all abilities. Welcome to the podcast, Anthony.
Thank you so much for having me, Mary.
I wonder if you could start by introducing yourself to our guests and share a little bit about how you came to become an accessibility advocate and speaker.
Well, it started for me at the age of 8, Mary, where I attended this camp in 1988 called Camp Marydale. And for all intents and purposes, in 1988, it really wasn't that accessible of a camp, but it was a camp that included people with disabilities and wasn't for directly with people with disabilities. And really, that was the opportunity for me to leave a mark. It gave me the opportunity to be in a community where I felt that I belonged. This was the first time outside of my family and friends, that I was in an opportunity to see where the community was. And, from that point, I'd met a man by the name of John Spatazzo, who was a worker at that time, and subsequently came on to be the executive director of the Catholic Youth Organization. And really that friendship kind of laid the groundwork to the man that I am today.
So in Canada, data shows that there's a clear gap in terms of employment for people with disabilities. What are your thoughts on the contributing factors to this gap?
Well, the gap for people with disabilities is really disheartening. It's really a drop in the bucket. $500 is all it takes for 90% of accommodations all across Ontario and Canada to employ a person with a disability. And for some reason, it just seems like there's a lot of stereotypes and stigmas behind the attitudes and perceptions of hiring a person with a disability, and that's something that really needs to be looked at more intensely.
And what do you hear from people with disabilities in terms of their experiences in the recruitment process, as well as once they've been hired? What kind of feedback would you like to pass along to employers?
Well, I mean, there's invisible versus visible disabilities, and it's the opportunity for disclosure. My disability being visible, once they see me in an interview, for example, I come in and I use my wheelchair, and they'll ask ahead of time, "Do you require any accommodations?" And more often than not, the answer is really no, provided the room that we're having the interview in is accessible. More often than not, there's a lot of moving of chairs, a little, moving of this and that and the other thing, just to kind of make the environment more comfortable for me. And I think a lot of that to me is more intimidating than making it comfortable. When it comes to rooms, for example, if a facility is accessible at the forefront, then all of this shuffling of chairs, for example, doesn't need to happen. I think there's a lot of concern or perception versus the reality of what disability looks like. People with disabilities go to school and earn particular diplomas or degrees, and don't necessarily land in the job that they went to school for. And I think that's also a conversation that needs to be had as well. And far too often, people with disabilities are being underutilized for the strengths that we have.
And what are some of the common accessibility barriers at the workplace that you've experienced in workplaces that they often miss?
I think first and foremost, Mary, it's a lack of understanding. Attitudes and the perception of disability versus the reality. I'm blessed to be in a lot of great workplaces. Even my own workplace where I get to set my own hours and set the precedent for how I work with above and beyond. But in the workplaces that I'm at, they're very they're very direct with me, and we're very direct with each other, saying these are accommodations that I require. And as time passes, things are going to change. With disability, and the health is going to change from one way or another. And that's what is referred to as dynamic disability. What presents itself today may not present itself tomorrow, and I'm blessed to be in a place where everybody understands that.
That's very interesting. So you're pointing out that over time, your own disability could change, and therefore your needs and accommodations might change within a workplace that you were trying to access. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I've been in the workplace at Mohawk College since 2005, and accommodations have changed. Certainly, the pandemic has really changed the way we look at workplaces now. The ability to work from home is more prevalent and more available now than it ever was. So that's definitely been a positive and a good thing for me personally, and I think it's a good thing for many people with disabilities to have the opportunity to be able to work, get paid in a space where they're most comfortable.
Now, you've talked about in your public speaking and your writing, you talked about the importance of being proactive instead of reactive in this area. Can you explain a little more about that and what it would look like for a workplace to proactively address accessibility concerns?
Well, I'll preface what I'm about to say, Mary, with what I say at the end of a conversation. Where there's a win for accessibility and inclusion, there's a win for everybody. So when we think of providing accommodations, when we think of providing accessibility, which those two words are two different have two different meanings, and in saying that, that when we provide the accommodations, when we provide the accessibility in a workplace, we all prosper from it. We all have the ability to do our jobs to the best of our abilities. And I think the backlash comes with the perception behind that there's a cost versus an investment to accessibility. And speaking to what I spoke about earlier, that 90% of accommodations can be had at $500 or less, and that is really a drop in the bucket. It's changing attitudes, changing the stereotypes, changing the stigmas behind accessibility and behind inclusion to ensure that we all have the safe opportunities in life.
So you mentioned the distinction between accommodations and accessibility, and that they had distinct meanings. And from your perspective, I would love to hear what those meanings are for our audience who may not be as, I guess, sophisticated in their understanding of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So an accommodation is meant for an individual, whereas accessibility is meant universally and for all. And I find that there's a lot of underlining misunderstandings because people tend to strive to be compliance of what the AODA stands for. And currently, we're having this conversation right now, Mary, in Disability Pride Month. So that is really something that I've been raising more and more awareness to. The AODA building codes set the precedence for a minimum standard. Set the precedence for not necessarily meeting the needs of people with disabilities because you're striving to meet a code. You're striving to meet compliance rather than meeting the actual needs of people with disabilities. You need people with disabilities at the beginning of a project, throughout the project, and conclusion of at the conclusion of a project to ensure that projects get completed and completed right the first time.
That's a really important point, and thank you for explaining it to us because I'm sure there's a lot of folks that are listening that don't truly appreciate the distinction. It's not part of their world. So your explanation is really helpful for a lot of employers out there. When it comes to the recruitment process, are there improvements that employers can make? I'm sure that there is. And we're talking about everything from job postings to communicating with candidates or even in the process of doing the job interview. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I love this question. I think disclosure is a very, very important part of the job recruitment process, the hiring process. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I identify as a person with a visible disability, but there's also hidden or invisible disabilities that people may not choose to disclose um, prior to receiving an interview. Whereas for me, I would disclose it myself prior to an interview to ensure the accommodations are met and met with respect and dignity. And then even understanding or hearing of um, receiving a job afterwards and then disclosing, there's an invisible disability. That tends to be a wrongfully a turnoff for an employer hiring an individual. When they make their facility accessible, when you hire a person with a disability, whether it be visible or invisible, you are contributing to the overall goodness of society and overall goodness of your workplace. That's not to say that your entire staff needs to be people with disabilities, but having that dynamic, having that diversity, really is an overall good step for the community at large.
Right. So it brings new voices to the table and all the decision making. And certainly we've heard a lot of that in the DEI conversation. But in terms of you I think reference IDEA, which includes the idea of accessibility. That again, it brings perspective that that otherwise an employer may not have.
Correct. And I've always transitioned from seeing the equity, diversity, and inclusion placemat in different types of workplaces to where is accessibility in that? It's typically hidden under the equity pillar. Let's give it its own pillar, transpose the letters to inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, giving that individual that idea behind looking at accessibility and inclusion from, whether it be hiring people with disabilities, making your workspace, if it's bricks and mortar, more accessible and inclusive for shoppers of all abilities to be able to access things equitably, making your online presence more accessible, making your visibility more accessible, and just giving that showmanship that you'll actually care about the community at large, and you're in a space where you're including everybody of all abilities.
Yeah, I mean, from a purely practical terms, not only are you accessing talent you might otherwise not have been able to access, but you're also showing it's good public relations. It's showing the values of the employer and what it means to other employees, what it means their commitment to the employees are as well, and a kind of employee engagement a strategy. It's very important.
Yeah, more often than not, you could see it dictated as a disclaimer or on a marquee. But if you're not showing the action behind your words, it's really just simply words.
Right. I mean, we're familiar with sort of performative kind of statements and policies, but it's really walking the talk that matters. You sometimes speak on the do's and don'ts of disability. What would you like to share with employers on that topic?
Well, I mean, disability comes in different forms. For example, mine's a physical disability. There's hearing disabilities, there's sight disabilities, and I think each of those dynamics have individual sets of do's and don'ts. And like for me, for example, one of the things that I stress quite often is don't touch my wheelchair without permission. Being forthright and talking to me. If an individual has a support person with them, direct your conversation to the individual rather than that support person. Being aware of light sensitivities, being aware of sound sensitivities, being aware of things that might cause sensory overloads, like distractions or too many people in an area, or things of that nature to kind of ease the opportunity for the abilities of those individuals to shine.
I just used the term walk your talk, and I remember when we first met, you said, "Yeah, well, I rolled my talk," and I.
You know what? I noticed that. I kept my mouth shut on that one, but I'm glad you brought that up, Mary.
Well,
Uh,
it just goes to show that we have these sort of I guess habits that are part of our language and part of our way of looking at the world, and it's important to hear from people like you to open our eyes and give us a better perspective. So I thank you for your generosity in that. But I do recall when we first spoke. I made that faux pas as well at that time. I wonder, can you tell us a bit about the Forward Movement painting project and how nonprofits can get involved with that?
yeah, absolutely. The forward movement came into Canada in 2017 from the States, which was called the Accessible Icon Project. Dylan Nitzkowitz and Jonathan Silver brought it into Ontario specifically to create the change from the universal symbol of accessibility to the dynamic symbol of access. And it's painted on parking lots and streets, and the symbol is being more and more used more prevalently. And it's the difference is a stagnant individual who uses a wheelchair sitting versus the individual propelling a wheelchair forward. And really, that's the game changer behind it, Mary. It's about moving forward. It's about changing the dynamic, and it's not about the person in the wheelchair. It's not about the disability. It's the need for change. It's the need for fundamental systemic and culture change to improve the quality of life for everybody of all abilities. And it starts and ends with those individuals with disabilities. I'll say that in Hamilton alone, the percentage of people with disabilities at 28% is greater than the provincial and national averages. Ontario resonates at 24% for people with disabilities, and Canada at 22. And those numbers are going to rise. Disability can happen to anyone at any time, temporary, permanent, or even worse, catastrophic. So, in saying that, the time is now to be proactive. The time to 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 be part and actively part of that fundamental systemic and culture change is now. So we're not relying on something that we could have had we been proactive.
Oh, it's very interesting. Are there other resources you'd like to direct employers to that could help them improve their workplace accessibility and give them a better idea of some of the solutions that they could embrace?
Yeah, the Employment Standards Act really does have a good piece on employing people with disabilities and understanding the dynamic and the need for change and the diversity in the workplace and how to include people with disabilities authentically and genuinely and respectfully. I think that is a big part of the solutions that are hopefully going forward. With Canada, we had the AODA signed June 13th, 2005, and we had a 20-year business plan, let's call it, to be fully accessible by January 1st, 2025. And to be frank, we missed the boat. When Ontario is sending out surveys with regards to the design of public spaces and the built environment and seeking the wisdom of people with disabilities at this juncture, we should be finalizing a lot of plans and finalizing what the future looks like rather than seeking the results from a survey. It seems like that's kind of like a Hail Mary, so to speak, in terms of wanting to show some activity into action of being accessible and inclusive.
Right. Without a survey does not actually, you may gain information, but it's not actually changing anything, does it? So I take your point well. As we wrap up our interview today, perhaps you could give us your thoughts on the power of inclusion and why it's so important for workplaces to embrace.
Absolutely. The power of inclusion really to me is something that I've embraced from day one. I spoke earlier about my interaction with John from the CYO, and the fact that I was included at a very young age, set the precedence for the man that I am today. starting above and beyond in 2016, being proactive and seeking the value of my own, personal needs when it comes to accommodations and accessibility, and empowering the voices of people with disabilities, but also their allies. And I want to define allies if I can, Mary. Allies is people that work with people with disabilities and not for people with disabilities. Understanding that the person with the disability has to have that autonomy, has to have that agency, has to have that power of choice to dictate the quality of life that we deserve. And really, that's how we can be truly accessible. And that's how we can truly be inclusive, by giving that space, that autonomy, that voice to dictate our own individual needs. And I understand through the Ontario Human Rights Code, there is a duty to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. And I feel like that's very loosely defined, in a sense that the accommodation needs to meet the need of that individual with a disability, or else not really a proper accommodation, first and foremost. So inclusion means, for me, giving that individual that space, that autonomy to be accepted into the environments that they're in, and being proponents for change, having a voice that helps eliminate the stereotype and the stigma behind discrimination, just behind the barriers. When we eradicate a single barrier, Mary, subsequent barriers are much more easier to topple down, because we've had that experience from that initial barrier, and we have to work together. As I mentioned earlier, with the 27.7% of people with disabilities, we need that 62.3% in allyship to ensure that the communities that we live in are accessible and inclusive for everybody. We have to be proactive on different types of needs and proponents for change, whether it be curb cuts, whether it be storefronts, whether it be, washrooms, whether it be buildings. Just because there's a way into a building doesn't mean it's accessible. Can we access every other part of that building that anybody else could? We've had a big talk on bathrooms, for example. What's the accessibility of a bathroom look like? How do we make sure that we include all the proponents of the different types of accessibility needs? Far too often, I go into a public building and I access a public bathroom or accessible bathroom that is not meant for me. Because far too often, they're made for right side dominant individuals. I happen to be left-handed, so for me, an accessible bathroom, predominantly on the right side of a stall, may have the space, but may not have the ability for me to use it, and use it safely as a left-handed individual. So, bottom line, this, Mary, plain and simple, inclusion is everybody, everywhere, all the time.
Well, Anthony, thank you for generously sharing your story and personal experience, along with your invaluable advice to nonprofits and charities across Canada about how to break down barriers and make their workplaces and their programs and communities more accessible. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thank you so much for having me.